how do we actually go about kitting out the lathe, etc., or setting it up for turning a bead?
The lathe should be set up for just general wood turning anyway. And there's nothing different to turning a bead to turning any of the other projects. You just start off with your stock of wood, you centre it up, you put it. I like to start it between centres, rough it down to a cylinder, and then mount the cylinder in the chuck, because that way you can then remove the tailstock from the support and work all round the bead, or all round the project.
So when you say you centre it, is this what you do with your ruler and your pencil?
You take a ruler, literally you mark corner to corner, turn it over, do the other side, and then the point of the drive centre and the point of the tailstock centre go into those crosses, and then that is the centre of the piece of wood. And that means really you'll get the biggest piece of wood out of the rough stock.
When you're roughing down, as you call it,
yeah,
you're using a specific chisel?
Yeah, again, it's very much how you get a feel for the wood and whether the wood's really hard or soft, or a big piece of wood or a small piece of wood. But you tend to use a roughing gouge, which is a scoop-shaped chisel, just to rough it down to a rough cylinder.
And what do you rest your fingers on, or the chisel on, to keep your hands steady?
The art of wood, the skill in wood turning, is keeping the chisel firm down onto the tool rest, because if it's not on the tool rest, it'll chatter, and then it can dig into the wood and be thrown. You can even throw the wood out of the chuck.
Okay. And at what angle do you hold the chisel? Is there a specific angle?
On the back of the chisels are all ground to an angle, and you just feed that in, so it's not rubbing on the stock. It's just making a nice cut, and you can alter the angle of the chisel as you're working, as the diameter and the shape of the wood changes.
So now that we've actually roughed down the wood, what's the next step?
Well, the next step is you start forming the rough shape of the bead, working on one side and then working on the other side. I try to leave the tailstock in place as long as possible. It just gives you more support. Right. But then you just rough out the shape of the bead, and then I like to use a small skew chisel, because that gives a very, very polished finish to the bead, so you don't have to do a great deal of sanding down.
And that's why your pieces are so smooth?
That's right, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So when we've actually started the shape, you then move on to doing a pattern into the bead?
You can do.
Yes.
The bead, just a basic bead, it can either be symmetrical, or you can have it slightly asymmetrical, so you've got a bigger curve on one side. You can have steps on it. You then work that shape into it, and really for a bead, that's all you need to do, is you work the shape out. you then sand it down.
Yeah.
Because even though you've used a nice sharp skew chisel, you still need to touch it with some fine sandpaper.
Yeah, I noticed you changed the sandpaper. Are you using different grades?
Yeah, I use a 180 grit, which is a very coarse grit, and then finish off with a 400 grit.
Right.
For very, very fine work, you can go down in steps. But because you use a sharp skew chisel, normally you can normally go straight in with a 400 grit paper.
So once you've smoothed off using the different grades of sandpaper,
Yeah.
I noticed you use a special cloth.
Yeah. When you finish sanding down, I always apply a sanding sealer, and that just literally seals the grain of the wood. And I'd normally apply that with a lathe stationary, but in some cases you can apply it with a lathe still in motion. But you must use a special turner's cloth, because if that gets snagged in the lathe, it will rip. It'll rip bits off rather than drag your hands into the turning wood.
So it's a particular type of fabric?
Yes, it is. I purchased it from wood turner supplies,
okay.
purely for wood turning.
Right. And then how do you create the hole through the centre of the bead now that you've shaped the bead?
Well, there's two ways of doing it. You can either finish the bead off, part it off, put it in a pillar drill, and then drill it like that, but it's very difficult to get the hole in the centre. What I like to do is just before the bead is parted off from the remaining stock that's in the chuck, is I put a drill chuck in the tailstock, put a 3mm drill in that, turn the speed of the lathe right down to very, very slow, and then just drill a hole in from the tailstock, and that way if you do it steadily you'll get a hole in the middle of the bead.
Okay, and then how do you remove the bead from the tailstock?
Again, I use a sharp skew chisel with my hand normally over supporting the bead. I just bring the skew chisel in and part it off.
So the bead that you've just finished and you've parted it off, how is it that the very end of this bead is shiny and smooth?
Two reasons for that. One, again, going back to using a sharp skew chisel will give you a nice finish anyway, but the bit that I couldn't get to while it was on the lathe with the turning stick, which is the wax stick that I use, when you rub the cloth on it and the piece is still spinning, it becomes slightly molten or liquid, and then you can just ease that into the gap, and then that will fill the grain and polish it up.